The wind on the Mongolian steppe does not ask permission. It comes from the north without warning, without mercy, driving ice and dust across a landscape so vast, and so indifferent to human survival that the people who lived there had no word for weakness. They could not afford one. The steppe was not a place where weakness was permitted to survive long enough to be named. It was a world of killing cold and burning summer, of grass that stretched to every horizon, without a tree to break it, of rivers that froze solid and thawed into murderous floods, of wolves that hunted in packs larger than some human communities. To be born on the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century AD was to be born into a permanent negotiation with extinction, and the terms of that negotiation were renegotiated every single day. The year is 1162, or thereabouts, the historical record, in the way of all great stories rooted in oral tradition, rooted in bureaucratic documentation, is imprecise about beginnings. What is not imprecise is the world into which the story opens, a world of fragmented tribes, constant warfare, and a human landscape in which loyalty was the most valuable commodity and betrayal was the most common transaction. The Mongolian steppe in the 12th century was not a unified civilization. It was a collection of warring tribes, Mongols, Tatars, Merkits, Naimans, Karits, Oirats, perpetually raiding each other's livestock, kidnapping each other's women and children, forming alliances that dissolved before the grass dried and feuds that lasted generations beyond the deaths of the men who started them. Blood was the currency of the steppe. Not gold, not grain, not silk from the distant Chinese cities to the south, blood. A tribe's power was measured in the number of warriors it could put on horseback, in the depth of the vendettas it could sustain, in the fear it could generate in the hearts of neighboring clans when its horsemen appeared on the horizon. There was no law beyond the law of the strong. There was no justice beyond the justice of the sword. There was no future beyond the next season's survival and the next raid's outcome. This was the world. This was the only world these people had ever known or imagined. To the south, behind the great walls that Chinese civilization had spent centuries and millions of lives building, lay the Jin dynasty. The Jurchen rulers who governed northern China with the wary attention of people who understood very well what lived beyond their northern border. The Jin had a policy for managing the steppe, keep it fragmented. A united steppe was an existential threat. A fragmented steppe was a manageable nuisance. A Chinese silk and silver flowed north in diplomatic payments to tribal leaders, willing to maintain the divisions, willing to turn their violence against neighboring tribes rather than against the walls of Chinese cities. It was a rational policy. It worked. For a while. To the west, the Islamic world stretched from Persia to Spain, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, the Seljuk Turks, the sophisticated urban civilizations of Samarkand and Bukhara and Merv, cities whose libraries contained the accumulated scholarship of centuries, whose bazaars traded in goods from China and India and Africa, whose minarets called millions of the faithful to prayer 5 times a day. These were civilizations of extraordinary achievement, architecturally, intellectually, commercially. They had walls. They had armies. They had the confidence of civilizations that had survived every threat the ancient world had thrown at them for 1,000 years. None of them knew what was coming. None of them could have imagined, in 1162, that within a single human lifetime, within the span of one man's years on earth, everything they knew would be put to the test in ways that most of it would not survive. That a boy born in a felt tent on the Mongolian steppe, the son of a minor tribal leader, would grow up to build the largest contiguous empire in human history. That he would kill more people than any individual before or after him in the pre-modern world. That he would also create a system of governance, commerce, and religious tolerance that the conquered world would eventually, grudgingly, recognize as a form of civilization. That he would be, simultaneously, the greatest monster and the greatest state builder of the medieval age. That his name would be spoken with terror, and with respect and with fascination, for 800 years after his death, and that the debate about what he truly was would never, could never be fully resolved. His name was Temujin. The world would know him by another name entirely. He was born holding a blood clot in his fist. This is what the secret history of the Mongols tells us. The extraordinary oral epic that is the primary Mongolian source for Genghis Khan's life. Transcribed in the 13th century from traditions that had been carried in the memories of bards and storytellers for generations. Born holding a blood clot in his right hand. The shamans who attended the birth read it as a sign this child would be a great warrior. A conqueror. A man whose destiny was written in blood before he had drawn his first breath. His father was Yesi J, a mid-ranking leader of the Borgigian clan of the Mongol tribe. Not a great Khan, not a powerful warlord, but a man of enough standing to have warriors who followed him and enemies who feared him. He named his newborn son Tem Jin after a Tatar leader he had just captured. A common step practice of honoring a victory by giving its memory to a new life. The name itself was a statement of ambition, a declaration that this child was born from triumph. The early years of Tem Jin's life are preserved in the secret history with a vivid specificity that carries the weight of genuine memory, even where it may also carry the embellishments of retrospective myth-making. He grew up on the banks of the Onon River in northeastern Mon River in the felt tent. The Jur, that was both home and the primary unit of steppe civilization. He learned to ride before he could fully walk. He learned to shoot a composite bow, the technological marvel of the steppe, a weapon of laminated wood, sinew, and horn that could drive an arrow through armor at 100 meters, before he was old enough to draw it to full strength. He learned the rhythms of pastoral nomadism, the seasonal migrations that followed the grass, the management of the horses and sheep and cattle, on whose survival his family's survival absolutely depended. He learned fear. This is the part of Tem Jin's childhood that the romantic retelling often obscures. He was not a fearless child. He was a frightened one. And the fear he experienced was real, specific, and formative in ways that shaped everything that came after. When Tem Jin was approximately 9 years old, his father Yes J took him to the camp of the Ongret tribe to negotiate a marriage betrothal. The standard mechanism by which steppe alliances were formed and cemented. The girl chosen was Biu Rate, the daughter of an Ongret chieftain. A girl of Tem Jin's age who would become the love of his life, the anchor of his identity, and the mother of his dynasty. Tem Jin was left at the Ongret camp while his father returned home. The custom was for the future groom to live with his future wife's family for a period before the marriage. On his way home, Yes Gay stopped at a Tatar encampment for hospitality. The Tatars who had old grudges against the Borgigian clan poisoned him. He died before he reached home. Tem Jin's father was dead. He was 9 years old. He was alone in a stranger's camp. And everything that followed, every conquest, every alliance, every act of violence, and every act of remarkable mercy, flows from this moment, with the terrible logic of a life shaped by abandonment and survival. He returned to find his family, his mother Atyelan, his younger brothers and sisters, abandoned by the Borgigian clan. This was standard steppe practice. When a tribal leader died, the clan redirected its loyalty and resources to living leaders, abandoning the widows and children of the dead to fend for themselves. The message delivered to Kialand and her children was as direct as a steppe winter. You are no longer our responsibility. Survive if you can. Helen was extraordinary. The secret history preserves her as a figure of ferocious maternal determination. A woman who fed her children by gathering roots and wild fruits and small game. Who refused to accept the verdict of abandonment. Who told her children with a fury that was also a form of love that they would survive. That they would not be defeated by the cruelty of people who had owed their loyalty to their father and transferred it, without hesitation, to someone else. She planted in Tem Jin a lesson that he never forgot and never forgave. Loyalty was the supreme virtue. Its absence was the supreme crime. The trauma deepened. When Tem Jin was approximately 13, a conflict arose with his older half, brother Bekter, over the allocation of food. Specifically over a fish and a bird that Tem Jin and his brother Kosar had caught, which Bekter and another half brother had taken. In the starvation conditions of the abandoned clan's survival existence, this was not a trivial matter. Food was life. Tem Jin and Kosar confronted Bekter and killed him. Shot him with arrows while he sat calmly, apparently not attempting to run. Apparently accepting his death with the composure of a man who had seen it coming. His mother's reaction is preserved in the secret history. She was furious. Not at the killing, exactly, but at the timing, the waste, the destruction of a potential alliance at a moment when the family could not afford to lose any resource. But Tem Jin had learned something from the killing, that would shape his military and political strategy for the rest of his life. That the decisive, early, preemptive elimination of a rival was cleaner and more permanent than any negotiated accommodation. You did not manage threats, you ended them. He was captured by the Taychut clan, former allies of his father's who had participated in the abandonment, and held prisoner with a wooden kangu around his neck, paraded from camp to camp as a demonstration of dominance over the Bojijan remnants. He escaped with the help of a sympathetic family named Sorkan, Shera, fleeing into the Onan River, hiding in the water up to his chin to escape pursuit. The humiliation was total. The determination it generated was equally total. He had been abandoned, he had been orphaned. He had survived starvation, he had killed, he had been captured and humiliated. He was, by any ordinary measure, a young man with every reason to be broken by the world's treatment of him. Instead, he was being forged. Every hardship was adding a layer of tempered steel to a personality that was developing, beneath the surface of a boy's face, into something that the steppe had not yet encountered. Something patient, something strategic. Something that nursed its grievances with the precision of a craftsman and waited for exactly the right moment to act on them. He was going to make the world pay attention. He was going to make it remember his name. And he was going to start very, very soon. The first thing Temujin did, when he was old enough to act on his own behalf, was retrieve Byorti. She was still at the Angeret camp. The betrothal had survived his father's death and his family's abandonment. A small miracle of social obligation holding in a world where most obligations dissolved the moment their guarantor died. He married her. It was not merely a romantic act. It was a political one. Bo-Reet brought with her a magnificent black sable coat, the kind of luxury item that carried real diplomatic weight on the steppe. Temujin knew exactly what to do with it. He took the coat to Togrul, Khan of the powerful Karait tribe, who had once been a blood brother of Temujin's dead father. He presented the coat as a gift. He asked for Togrul's protection. He was, in the language of the steppe, offering himself as a vassal, in exchange for the shelter of a powerful patron. It was a tactical masterstroke from a young man who had almost napped it. Togrul accepted, and Temujin had his first alliance, not an alliance of equals, but a relationship that gave him access to Karait military resources and Karait prestige, while he built his own power base from essentially zero. The Merkit struck first. This was the crisis that would define Temujin's early career and demonstrate, in brutal terms, both his vulnerability and the quality of his response. The Merkits had an old grievance against the Bojijan clan. Temujin's father had kidnapped Epslo Loon from a Merkitman years before, and blood debts on the steppe did not expire with the death of the man who incurred them. 300 Merkit warriors swept down on Temujin's camp in the night. Temujin escaped into the forest. Beret did not. She was taken, captured, distributed among the Merkits as a slave and concubine. And Temujin, barely 20 years old, with a small band of followers and no guaranteed military force, had to choose between accepting this loss as the price of survival or risking everything to get her back. He chose to get her back. And the way he chose to do it revealed the strategic intelligence that would define his entire career. He did not attempt to rescue her with the inadequate forces he commanded. He leveraged his alliance. He went to Togrul and described the injury done to him. The kidnapping of his wife, the insult to his honor. The blood debt now owed, and Togrul, applying the logic of steppe patronage, was obligated to help. Togrul in turn reached out to another tribal leader Jamuga, a powerful Mongol Khan who was also in one of the steppe's characteristic intimacies. Temujin's childhood blood brother, his Anda, sworn penyon from a ceremony of loyalty performed years before. The combined force swept through the Merkit camps. Borat was recovered. She was pregnant, and the question of who had fathered the child was never fully answered in the secret history, left deliberately ambiguous in a text that was composed under the patronage of Genghis Khan's descendants. The child born was Jochi, the guest, whose paternity would shadow his entire life and become one of the central dynastic tensions of the Mongol Empire. Temujin acknowledged Jochi as his son. He never wavered from that acknowledgement publicly. But the shadow remained. The victory over the Merkits established Temujin's reputation in ways that went beyond the military result. He had demonstrated that he could form and execute alliances. He had demonstrated the reach of his network. He had demonstrated that injuries to him would be answered with overwhelming force. A crucial signal on a steppe where the perception of weakness attracted predators, the way the smell of blood attracted wolves. Warriors began to come to him. Not many. At first, dozens, then hundreds, drawn by the reputation he was building, and by the quality of the rewards he offered those who followed him. Temujin's leadership style was, from the beginning, distinctive in ways that would eventually make him revolutionary. He did not organize his followers along traditional kinship lines. This was the radical departure. On the steppe, loyalty flowed through blood. You followed your clan, your tribe, your kinship group, because these were the people who were obligated to protect you, and whom you were obligated to protect. Temujin began building something different, a meritocracy of loyalty. He rewarded men who served him well regardless of their tribal origin. He promoted capable individuals over high-born incompetence. He created bonds of personal loyalty that cut across and eventually superseded the tribal loyalties that had kept the steppe perpetually fragmented. His friendship with Jamuka deepened, and then fractured. The fracture was inevitable, in retrospect, because both men were building toward the same goal from different starting points. Jamuka represented the traditional steppe aristocratic order, power flowing through bloodline and clan hierarchy, the high-born ruling because they were high-born. Temujin represented something new, power flowing through personal merit and demonstrated loyalty, the capable ruling because they were capable. These were not merely different leadership styles. They were different visions of how the steppe world should be organized. They could not both win. The break between them came after they had camped together, and the two camps had separated in a way that, in the subtle social grammar of the steppe, signaled the end of brotherhood. War was coming between them, both men knew it, but not yet. The immediate enemy was more established. The immediate test was larger, and Temujin was not yet ready for the confrontation that would decide everything. He was still bidding, still gathering, still forging. From the raw material of steppe warfare and personal loyalty and meritocratic organization, the instrument that was going to change the world. The steppe had a mechanism for recognizing ultimate authority. It was called the Kurultai, the great assembly of tribal leaders, and when it convened and bestowed the title of Khan, it was the closest thing the Mongolian world had to a coronation. In 1206, a Kurultai was convened at the source of the Onon River. And what it bestowed was not merely the title of Khan. It bestowed the title of Genghis Khan, or Genghis Khan, in the more accurate transliteration, a title whose exact meaning is debated by scholars but most plausibly means the Aversa ruler, or Oceanic ruler, a title that contained within it a claim not to tribal leadership but to global sovereignty. It was an extraordinary declaration for a man standing in a felt tent on the Mongolian steppe. But by 1206, the declaration was not hubris. It was description. The years between Temujin's early alliance building and the 1206 Kurultai had been years of systematic, patient, and utterly ruthless conquest and consolidation. Every major tribal confederation of the steppe had been confronted and defeated. The Tatars who had poisoned his father were destroyed, the men killed, the women and children absorbed. Genghis Khan applied a specific calculation to the Tatar massacre. He ordered all Tatar men taller than the linchpin of a wagon wheel killed. Children who had not yet reached that height were spared and absorbed into Mongol families. The logic was precise and brutal: eliminate the generation capable of revenge, absorb the generation that could be made loyal. Justice and pragmatism in the same action. The Merkits who had kidnapped Bridi were destroyed. Jamuka, his childhood blood brother Hisanda, the man who had once been closer to him than any other, was defeated in battle, captured, and executed. The execution was carried out with a specific and meaningful mercy. Jamuka asked to die without the shedding of blood. The noble steppe death. The death reserved for those of royal lineage whose blood was too sacred to spill on the ground. Genghis Khan granted it. He had Jamuka killed by having his back broken. It was an act that honored the man he had loved as a brother, while fulfilling the political necessity of removing the only rival whose claim to steppe leadership could match his own. The Karates Togrul's tribe, his former patrons, were destroyed after Togrul was manipulated into a confrontation through a series of political maneuvers involving Genghis Khan's sons and Togrul's own son Sengam, whose jealousy and distrust of the rising Mongol leader provided the lever needed to break the alliance. Togro fled, and was killed by Naimans, who did not recognize him, and did not know they had just made the worst possible enemy. The Naimans themselves were next. Their defeat required one of the most sophisticated military operations Genghis Khan had yet conducted, a multi-column, converging attack against a fortified position, conducted over difficult terrain against a larger defending force, and its success demonstrated that the Mongol military system had evolved far beyond the simple cavalry raid that characterized traditional steppe warfare. That military system deserves careful attention, because it was the instrument through which the entire subsequent history was forged. Genghis Khan reorganized the Mongol army from its traditional tribal structure into a decimal system units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. These units cut across tribal affiliations. A Minghan might contain men from a dozen different tribes, bound by oath and organizational structure, rather than kinship. The commanders of these units were appointed on merit by Genghis Khan personally. They owed their position to him, not to their birth. This created an army of extraordinary cohesion and flexibility, capable of executing complex multi-part maneuvers that tribal confederations, where individual units owed loyalty to their tribal leader, rather than to the overall commander, could not match. The tactics that emerged from this system were sophisticated far beyond what contemporaries expected from nomadic warriors. The Mangudai, a feigned retreat designed to draw an enemy cavalry pursuit into a prepared encirclement, was executed with a discipline that required units to flee convincingly, maintain formation under apparent rout, and wheel and counterattack at precisely the right moment. Armies that had defeated every previous enemy they had faced were destroyed by this tactic, because they could not believe, until it was too late, that the fleeing Mongols were not actually fleeing. The Lekher, the personal retinue of loyal companions, formed an elite corps whose tactical judgment and personal bravery set the standard for the entire army. Scouts ranged hundreds of miles ahead of the main force, gathering intelligence with a systematic thoroughness that gave Mongol commanders a picture of the battlefield, the terrain, the enemy dispositions, the water sources, the political divisions among the defenders, that no enemy they faced could match. Intelligence. That word is crucial. Genghis Khan did not conquer through brute force alone. He conquered through information. Before any major campaign, a network of merchants, travelers, and deliberate agents penetrated the target society, identifying the political divisions, the military capabilities, the physical geography, the personalities of key leaders, the likely responses to different approaches. When the Mongol army moved, it moved with a knowledge of its objective that did not possess in return. By 1206, the steppe was unified. Every tribe, every clan, every nomadic confederation from the forests of Siberia to the deserts of Central Asia acknowledged Genghis Khan as supreme ruler. The instrument, the army, the organizational system, the intelligence networks, the leadership structure, was complete. The universal ruler had his universal army, and the direction it was pointing was south and west, and every other direction that a world beyond the steppe lay waiting to be confronted. The first great conquest was China, or rather, the first of China's three regimes that Genghis Khan would attack, because China, in the early 13th century, was not a unified state but three separate political entities: the Shishao kingdom of the Tanguts in the northwest, the Jin dynasty of the Jurchens in the north, and the Song dynasty in the south. Genghis Khan began with the weakest and nearest, the Shishia, attacking in a series of campaigns beginning around 1205 that demonstrated the Mongol army's capacity to operate not merely as a cavalry raiding force, but as a combined, arms military machine capable of besieging cities. This was the challenge that China presented, and that the Mongols had to solve. The steppe cavalry that was devastating in open battle was ineffective against walled cities. The Jin dynasty had been building walls and fortified cities for precisely this reason: to negate the steppe cavalry's tactical advantages. Genghis Khan's response was to acquire the capability he lacked. From the Shishao campaigns, from the early campaigns against the Jin, from the absorption of conquered peoples who brought their knowledge and skills into Mongol service, the Mongol army developed a siege capability of formidable effectiveness. Chinese and later Persian engineers brought siege engines, catapults, trebuchets, battering rams into Mongol service. The army that had been unstoppable in the open field became unstoppable before walls as well. The Jin campaigns, beginning in earnest in 1211, demonstrated the full terrifying capability of the mature Mongol military machine. Jin armies that outnumbered the Mongols and fought in terrain that should have favored the defender were destroyed in detail by the combination of Mongol tactical sophistication, intelligence supremacy, and the sheer shock effect of an army that appeared to come from everywhere simultaneously. The Jin capital at Zhongdu, modern Beijing, fell in 1215, sacked with a thoroughness that left it burning for a month. The Jin dynasty survived, retreating south, but it was mortally wounded, a wound that Genghis Khan's successors would eventually make fatal. But the campaign that tested the Mongol system most severely, and that wrote the deepest stain on Genghis Khan's historical legacy, was the campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire to the west. The Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad Sikar ruled a vast territory stretching from modern Iran through Central Asia. The great Silk Road cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, and Nishapur lay within his domain. It was one of the most sophisticated and commercially important civilizations in the world, and its destruction was triggered by an act of catastrophic arrogance. Genghis Khan initially approached the Khwarezmian Empire as a trading partner. A large caravan of Mongol-sponsored merchants traveled west, loaded with goods, and a diplomatic letter proposing commercial relations. The governor of the Khwarezmian border city of Otrar, acting with the Shah's approval or at least acquiescence, had the merchants arrested and executed as spies, confiscated the goods. Genghis Khan sent a diplomatic mission demanding satisfaction. Muhammad had the ambassadors killed. This was the wrong decision. This was, arguably, the worst single decision made by any ruler in the medieval world. Because what followed was not a punitive raid. It was annihilation. The Mongol campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire, launched in Qi 19 with a force of approximately 150,000 men, was conducted with a strategic sophistication that still astonishes military historians. Rather than advancing on a single front, Genghis Khan split his forces into multiple columns that appeared simultaneously from different directions, paralyzing the Khwarezmian command structure and preventing the concentration of their larger but less mobile forces. The Shah, uncertain where the main blow was coming and unwilling to risk his army in open battle, dispersed his forces into the cities, which converted his numerical advantage into a liability, spreading his strength across 100 fortified points that the Mongols could now reduce one by one. Bukhara fell. Genghis Khan rode into the great mosque and reportedly addressed the assembled population from the pulpit, telling them that he was the flail of God, that if they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent such punishment upon them. Whether he actually said these words is uncertain. They come from Muslim sources written after the fact. But the sentiment they express is historically important. Genghis Khan understood, and used, the religious and psychological impact of his conquests as a deliberate instrument of warfare. Terror was a weapon. The reputation for total destruction that preceded the Mongol army often produced surrender without battle, which was the preferred outcome, since it preserved infrastructure and population that a destroyed city could not. Samarkand fell. Nishapur fell. Merv fell. The population statistics attached to these falls, recorded by Persian and Arab chroniclers who may have exaggerated but were describing a genuine catastrophe, are still almost impossible to absorb. Merv, reportedly one of the largest cities in the world at the time, was reportedly subjected to a systematic killing that lasted days. The numbers cannot be verified. But the destruction of the urban, commercial, and intellectual fabric of Central Asia, the irrigation system smashed, the libraries burned, the artisans killed or scattered, the agricultural infrastructure obliterated, was real and documented, and its effects persisted for generations. At the peak of his power, Genghis Khan governed not merely an empire but a system. The Yasa, the Mongol law code attributed to Genghis Khan, established a framework of rules that applied across the empire. Rules about military discipline, about the treatment of conquered peoples, about religious freedom, about the obligations of subjects and the rights of rulers. The Yasa's enforcement was brutal and consistent, but its content included provisions, particularly around religious toleration, that were extraordinary for the era. Genghis Khan exempted religious clergy of all faiths from taxation. He guaranteed freedom of worship to Christians, Muslims, Buddhists and shamanists alike. This was not idealism, it was pragmatism. A religiously tolerant empire could extract the intellectual and administrative talent of all its subjects, rather than just those who shared the ruler's faith. But pragmatism and benefit were not mutually exclusive, and the populations that survived Mongol conquest and lived under the Pax Mongolica often acknowledged a genuine administrative competence beneath the violence of conquest. The Silk Road under Mongol dominance functioned with a security and efficiency it had not seen in generations. Yam. The postal relay system that Genghis Khan established across the empire allowed messages and goods to travel from China to Persia in weeks rather than months. Merchants moved with a safety that the politically fragmented pre-Mongol landscape had not permitted. The Pax Mongolica, the peace of the Mongols, was real. However blood soaked its foundations. He was 60. Or thereabouts. The birth year is uncertain. He had conquered more territory than any human being in history. He had killed more people than any individual before or after him in the pre-modern world. He had built a system of governance and commerce that was, for all its violence, functional and durable. And he was not done. He was never done. The steppe wind keeps blowing. The universal ruler kept moving. The Xia problem would not stay solved. Genghis Khan had attacked the Tangut kingdom of Xia multiple times, 1205, 1207, 1209, 1211, each time extracting tribute, hostages, and acknowledgement of Mongol suzerainty, and each time finding that Tangut compliance dissolved as soon as the Mongol army moved on to other targets. The Xia were a persistent, nagging vulnerability at the empire's eastern flank, a kingdom that had agreed to subordination without genuinely accepting it. That paid tribute when forced and withheld it when not. When Genghis Khan launched his Great Western campaign against the Khwarezmians in 1219, he requested Xia military support. The Tangut response, "If you do not have enough troops, you should not fight," was delivered with a contempt that guaranteed a final reckoning. But the Western campaign produced its own crisis, one more intimate and more damaging than any battlefield defeat. While Genghis Khan was conducting the Khwarezmian campaign, his eldest son Jochi, the son whose paternity was permanently shadowed by the circumstances of his birth, was supposed to be closing the ring around the fleeing Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad. He did not. He moved slowly. He communicated infrequently. He appeared to the eyes of his father and his brothers to be conducting a semi-independent campaign that served his own strategic interests more than his father's explicit orders. The tension between Genghis Khan and Jochi was one of the defining fault lines of the Mongol imperial family, and it mapped directly onto the question of succession, the question that every empire built by a single extraordinary individual must eventually confront. Genghis Khan had 4 sons by Bu-Rate, Jochi, Chagatai, Ugadi, and Tolii, and the question of which would succeed him was complicated, politically explosive, and never fully resolved in his lifetime. Jochi's legitimacy was perpetually questioned. Chagatai was powerful and opinionated, but temperamentally unsuited to the diplomatic demands of supreme leadership. Ugadi was genial, politically skilled, and broadly acceptable to the other brothers and tribal leaders. Tolui was the youngest and the most closely associated with his father, commanding the Mongol heartland by tradition. The relationship between Jochi and Chagatai deteriorated into open hostility. They reportedly came to physical confrontation in their father's court, requiring Genghis Khan to separate them and impose an awkward formality of reconciliation. The succession question was addressed, provisionally, at a Kurultai around 1218-1219, where Ugadi was designated as preferred successor. But designating a successor was not resolving the succession. It was postponing the resolution until the moment when a living ruler's authority could no longer enforce the choice. The Battle of the Indus in 1221 demonstrated the military system at its most complete. Genghis Khan's pursuit of Jalal ad-Din, the son of Shah Muhammad, and the most capable military commander the Mongols faced in the Khwarezmian campaign, drove across modern Afghanistan and Pakistan to the Indus River, where Jalal ad-Din made a final desperate stand. He was defeated. His army was destroyed. He escaped across the Indus by swimming his horse, a feat of personal courage that Genghis Khan reportedly watched from the far bank and acknowledged with something approaching admiration. He did not pursue beyond the Indus. The reasons are debated: logistical constraints, the Indian climate, perhaps a genuine recognition of a limit. The limits were becoming visible. Not military limits, the Mongol army remained undefeated in any decisive sense. But the limits of geography, of logistics, of the human body's capacity to sustain campaigns of this duration and intensity. Genghis Khan had been fighting continuously, with minimal respite, for more than 2 decades. His body carried the accumulated damage of that history. He was aging. And the empire he had built, already stretching from Korea to Persia, was beginning to press against the logistical boundaries of what a horse, transported, pastoral, nomadic administrative system, could hold together. And the Sisha still awaited. The debt had not been paid. The insult of 1219 had not been answered. Genghis Khan turned east. The final campaign against the Sisha began in 1226. It was, by all accounts, the most systematic and thorough destruction Genghis Khan had yet ordered, not the selective terror of the Khwarezmian campaign, calibrated to produce surrender through fear, but something closer to a genuine extermination, driven by a personal fury that the aging Khan did not attempt to moderate. The Sisha had broken faith too many times. They had been forgiven too many times. The campaign of 1226-1227 moved through the Tangut kingdom with the methodical finality of a death sentence being executed. Cities fell. Populations were destroyed. The Tangut civilization, which had its own writing system, its own Buddhist scholarship, its own architectural tradition, was so thoroughly dismantled that it virtually disappeared from history, leaving behind only ruins and fragments insufficient to fully reconstruct what had been lost. Genghis Khan did not live to see its completion. In the summer of 1227, while the Sisha campaign was still in progress, he died. The exact cause of his death is recorded differently in different sources. The secret history suggests injuries sustained in a fall from his horse during a hunting expedition before the campaign. Chinese sources suggest illness. Later traditions offer various romantic or dramatic alternatives. The truth is inaccessible. What is accessible is the fact. The universal ruler died somewhere in the field during his final campaign, at an age estimated between 60 and 70 years, in a tent on campaign, as he had lived. His instructions for his burial were a final exercise of the control he had maintained over everything else. He was to be buried in secret. No monument. No marker. The burial party would kill everyone they encountered on the burial site, to prevent knowledge of the location from spreading. The horses that trampled the grave would be killed. Trees would be planted to conceal the mound. Everything that he had done in life had been designed to be visible, permanent and world-changing. His death was designed to be invisible. He has never been found. The tomb of Genghis Khan remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. Searched for, theorized about, occasionally claimed to have been discovered, never conclusively located. A man whose life reshaped the world lies somewhere in the Mongolian earth with no marker and no memorial. As completely hidden as he could make himself. The empire did not collapse with his death. This was the testament to the institutional structures he had built. Ugedi was confirmed as Great Khan at a Kurultai, and continued his father's expansion with considerable success. The Jin dynasty was finally destroyed in 1234. The Mongol advance into Europe reached Poland and Hungary in 1241. Before Gedi's death brought it to a halt, the Middle East campaigns continued. The empire reached its maximum territorial extent under Genghis Khan's grandsons, Kublai Khan in China, Echi-Lagyu in Persia and the Middle East, Batu Khan on the Pontic steppe of Russia and Eastern Europe. But the unified empire began to fracture almost immediately after Ugedi's death. The succession crisis that Genghis Khan had managed through the force of his personal authority became, without that authority, centrifugal forces pulling the empire apart. The Khanates, the Golden Or, the Yu Khanate, the Chagatai Khanate, the Yuan dynasty in China, became increasingly independent, fighting each other as readily as they fought external enemies. The instrument that Genghis Khan had forged became, in the hands of his descendants, several instruments pursuing separate purposes. The Baghdad catastrophe of 1258, Echu-Legis sack of the Abbasid capital, the killing of the Caliph, the destruction of the House of Wisdom with its centuries of accumulated Islamic scholarship, was one of the most consequential events of the medieval world, a blow to Islamic civilization, whose effects echoed for generations. The Mongols who conquered the Middle East eventually converted to Islam, and became its defenders rather than its destroyers. The Mongols of China became Chinese, adopting the cultural forms of the civilization they had conquered. The Mongols of Russia became the Golden Horde, a Eurasian power that shaped Russian political development for centuries. They were absorbed by the world they had conquered. The universal empire dissolved back into the particular. And Genghis Khan lay in his unmarked grave, as invisible as he had demanded. 800 years have passed, and the argument about Genghis Khan has never ended. It may never end, because the man himself contains a contradiction so fundamental that no single interpretive framework can fully contain it. He was the greatest mass killer in pre-modern history, responsible directly and through the campaigns he ordered, for the deaths of tens of millions of people across China, Central Asia, Persia, and Eastern Europe. Modern demographic studies suggest that the Mongol conquests reduced the global population by somewhere between 5 and 10%. An apocalyptic achievement in the strict demographic sense of the word. Central Asian cities whose populations had been numbered in the hundreds of thousands in 1200 were ghost towns or ash in 1230. The agricultural infrastructure of Persia and Mesopotamia, the irrigation systems that had supported civilization in those regions for 4,000 years, was destroyed in ways that took centuries to partially repair, and in some cases was never fully repaired. Landscapes that had fed millions were converted to steppe pasture. The long arc of certain civilizations was permanently bent or broken by the Mongol passage. And yet, the same man who ordered these destructions also built a legal code that guaranteed religious freedom across the largest empire the world had ever seen. He created the conditions for the Pax Mongolica, the century of relative peace across the Silk Road that allowed an unprecedented exchange of goods, peoples, ideas, and diseases between China and Europe. The Black Death that devastated Europe in the 1340s traveled along the Mongol, secured trade routes, which were also the routes that carried Chinese paper making and printing technology westward, that carried spices and silk and the mathematical knowledge that would eventually feed the European Renaissance. The catastrophe and the cultural transmission were products of the same system. Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty preserved Chinese civilization, even as it conquered it. The administrative and cultural institutions of China were absorbed and maintained, and the dynasty eventually became more Chinese than Mongol. The Ilkhanate of Persia became one of the great patrons of Persian art and scholarship, producing under Rashid al-Din one of the most comprehensive world histories ever attempted in the medieval period. The Golden Horde shaped the political culture of Russia, in ways that Russian historians have debated ever since. The centralized authority, the bureaucratic tradition, the diplomatic habits of a civilization that spent 2 centuries paying tribute to Mongol rulers. The genetic legacy is measurable in ways that the historical legacy is not. Genetic studies published in the early 21st century identified a Y chromosome lineage carried by approximately 8% of men across a vast swath of Asia from China to Central Asia. Statistically consistent with descent from a single individual living in the Mongolian region around the 13th century. The star cluster, as geneticists call it, is almost certainly the biological trace of Genghis Khan and his male descendants, the product of the reproductive access that supreme power confers, and that the Mongol imperial family exercised across generations of conquest. 16 million men alive today may carry Genghis Khan's Y chromosome. His genetic presence in the living world is literally fully identified historical individual. Modern Mongolia looks at Genghis Khan with an uncomplicated pride that the rest of the world finds difficult to fully share. His face is on the currency. His name is on the airport. His enormous equestrian statue, 40 meters of stainless steel, the largest equestrian statue in the world, stands on the steppe outside Ulaanbaatar, facing east toward the homeland he came from, toward the world he rode out to conquer. In Mongolia, he is not primarily the destroyer of cities. He is the unifier of the steppe, the creator of the nation, the man who took a fragmented collection of warring tribes and forged from them a civilization that the world could not ignore. The Mongolian national identity is built on his foundation. His legacy there is not problematic, it is foundational. The tension between these perspectives, destroyer and unifier, monster and statesman, the man who killed millions and the man who built the largest free trade zone in medieval history, cannot be resolved. It can only be held as the evidence that history does not produce simple figures whose meaning can be cleanly extracted and applied. held as the evidence that great power is always morally complex, that the same force which builds and protects also destroys and kills. That the line between the two is not always clear, and is sometimes deliberately erased by those who exercise the power. The Mongolian steppe today looks very much as it did in Evan. The grass still runs to every horizon. The sky is still enormous. The wind still comes from the north without permission, and without mercy. Horses still move across the landscape in groups, their breath visible in the cold air. The sound of their hooves carrying across distances that flatten sound and stretch time. Somewhere beneath that earth, unmarked and undisturbed, the universal ruler rests. He changed the world more than almost any individual who has ever lived. He left it with no instructions, no monument, no marker. Nothing except the world he had remade, still remaking itself from what he had done to it, still trying to understand what he had been. Still trying, after 800 years, still trying.